Whisper. Oh, I can hear my.
Okay, we're good. I'm just gonna turn this off, so.
No, but I, you know, yeah, let's talk, I have a lot of rest house. There's like,
Do you need a mic? Second part, you can borrow this one.
I'll give you a signal.
Muted, right? Yeah, I just turned it off. Yep. Mhm. Yep. Yep. Yeah.
We should get started, it's 4 o'clock. Welcome and thanks everyone for coming. Today it's my pleasure to introduce Catherine Batchley, who's going to give our seminar this afternoon. Catherine is a professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Michigan. And she has a wide range of research expertise in both biology and geology. She has got feet in both worlds and is an expert at bringing them together. She's also an excellent field biologist. She's traveled all over the world doing field work, both in North America, out in the West, but also in far-flung places like Pakistan and Tibet and China. So it's been all over the rocks in a lot of different countries looking for fossils. Growing up myself as a college student, I was very aware of Catherine's work. And I was really interested in working with her at grad school. So I applied to be her student. I didn't actually end up working with her because she was off in some other country at the time, not taking students. And so the University of Michigan went down on my list because Catherine wasn't available. But I've been lucky enough to get to work with her pretty closely over the last 7 to 10 years. As a colleague, and she's become a really good friend. And I was very nervous when I first met her. She was the president of the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology, and I was just a lowly grad student. But I got to meet her at one of the meetings, and it turned out she was this incredibly warm and welcoming and energetic and exciting person to talk to. And so when she called me up at, I don't know, 10 years ago and invited me out to Essence, the National Evolutionary Synthesis Center, which doesn't exist anymore. To start thinking about these ideas about dynamic landscapes and how they feed into mammal diversification. It was an easy answer. Yes, I signed up, and it's been a highlight of my career working with Catherine. So I'm really excited that she's here visiting, and excited to have her share her insights with you.
Great. Thanks so much, Becca. And in many ways, it's been a very reciprocal pleasure. I've learned a lot from Becca as well, and been very much inspired and motivated by her work as well. Thank you all for coming. I'll reiterate what Becca said. Today, I'm going to talk about a number of findings that I'm going to present on behalf of a large group, and that's why I have et al. in my title here, or my author list. So I'm going to start talking about, I'm going to focus on mountainous regions and topographic complexity. And I'm sure most of you know that mountainous regions today are biodiversity hotspots, recognized by biologists and paleontologists alike, and for many different groups, for mammals, for birds, for plants, groups that have been very well documented over much of the terrestrial world. And actually although I won't talk about them today, they're also very interesting counterparts in the marine world, for some of the same reasons, I think. And among mammals, especially for small mammals. And so this heat map, looking at the species density of rodents, with the warm colors representing regions with more rodents, is highlighting much of the topography of Western North America. So we see this conjunction of mountainous regions and high species richness. And this pattern first became striking to me when did an analysis of the biodiversity or the biogeography of modern mammals of North America. And I was very struck by the fact that the longitudinal gradient is even more striking than the latitudinal gradient. And I thought, why? And of course, it's immediately obvious if you look at a topographic map that, you know, the species density is following the mountainous regions. And so I thought, is that a pattern that's persisted throughout much of Earth history? What happens if we look at that in deep time? And that was the beginning of my investigation of this subject. And now, because I'm in Oregon, I actually took some time with my research assistant to go through the wonderful book of Mammals of Oregon and to see if a somewhat similar pattern holds. And if we just look at the small mammal, the rodents, we see 8 species that live primarily west of the Cascades, 33 that are predominantly in the Cascades and their flanks on the east and west, and then 18 whose ranges are limited to the high plains or the high deserts of eastern Oregon. And this does have a taxonomic character. If we look at these light green circles, these are the one species of the mountain beaver that's found primarily west of the Cascades. And if we look at these light blue symbols, these are the kangaroo and pocket mice that live primarily east of the Cascades. So we do see the topographic diversity gradient right here in your lucky backyard. And realizing that this is not a question that I could easily answer by myself, I decided to start to talk to colleagues about gathering together a group of geologists, paleontologists, mammalogists to try to approach this topic together. And we were very fortunate after that meeting at NESCENT, where our ideas for a grant proposal were born to apply to the National Science Foundation for funding from the Research Coordination Network program. And fortunately, we were able to get one of their grants. And so for a number of years, we met at least once a year, and then continued meeting right through the pandemic and had our final year of funding last year. Although even though the funding is now over, I would say our collaborations are continuing. So during that NESCENT meeting, during a coffee break, a group of people and I wasn't present here for this little group, said, well, we need to come up with a good name. So within about 10 minutes, they'd come up with the acronym NARLI, which I thought was a wonderful word. North American Rodents, Landscapes, Evolution, and Ecology. So NARLI stuck immediately. So now we call ourselves the NARLI Group. And we focus on Western North America, not because we're Western North America chauvinists, but because there were a whole series of very recent tectonic analyses of Western North America that were helping us to document the landscape history in the kind of detail that we needed. And in addition, we knew that the mammals of North America are very, very well documented. And furthermore, there's an excellent fossil record both in the intermontane region as well as on the Great Plains. So in a way, we had all the ingredients that we needed in one region, and we could not think of any other part of the world which has all that information ready for these kinds of questions. So that's why the focus is there. And one of our informal slogans once we started going out in the field was 30 million years plus or minus 2 kilometers, to emphasize that we're talking about the intersection of time and space. And we met in workshops in person, and then during the pandemic online, and then we had 3 fantastic field trips. And the question we were all focused on is which tectonic and climatic processes influence the richness and diversification history of small mammals over time. And I have small in parentheses because a couple of our findings actually involve collating the data for all mammal species, but mostly we focus on small mammals. And primarily we focus on small mammals because they are the more numerous, they are the numerous parts of mammals. If you look at rodents, are something like 35% of all mammal species. Bats are another 25% or more. And so once you put those two together, and most of them weigh less than a kilo or less, then you've got most of mammal diversity in small mammals. So that's one reason that it's really important to study them. And surprisingly, they have a very good fossil record. At least rodents do. Bats not quite so much. And so we had 7 years of funded collaboration, initially 5, and then we were able to extend that a couple of times. and make our money go further, because for 2 years we just met online. And so we never had to pay for any airfares or hotel bills. And then we had 3 wonderful field trips, and each one of these events had 25 to 30 people present, and often at least half of them students. And the field trips, of course, brought the subject to life most vividly, because we would study all aspects of this subject. Some of us, we'd go and look at fossil sites, we'd look at, huge tectonic landscapes, and we'd also look at modern mammal habitats, and sometimes live trap small mammals as well. And because we represented so many fields, everyone in their own way was a student, because everyone had something to learn from somebody else, and everybody had something to offer somebody else as well. So I'm just going to show you a brief glimpse of one photo from each of our field trips in reverse order. Our last field trip was last year in Colorado, where we started in the edge of the Great Plains, looking at an experimental grassland. Then immediately we went up right to the Flatirons, right next to Boulder, to look at the tectonic junction between the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains. And then we spent the next 3 days in the Rocky Mountains. And this is Bill Holt, who's a structural geologist from Stony Brook, drawing a diagram explaining how the Rio Grande Rift interacts with the Colorado Plateau and the plate boundaries far to the west. And then the second field trip took us out of the mountains, out onto the plains, because we wanted to understand what a lowland habitat and what kinds of habitat heterogeneity offer, and how small mammals make their living there. And it was extremely revealing in ways that none of us were expecting. And here we are on one of those days at the Konza Prairie Long-Term Ecological Research Site in Manhattan, Kansas. And that was a terrific field trip. Then our first field trip was in the Basin and Range, where we started out in Western Nevada, then went into Death Valley, Panamint Valley, Owens Valley, then came down to the Barstow Formation, where here we're all having lunch before we get dumped on by a huge thunderstorm approaching from the west. But this was showing us what some of the Miocene record of this mammal diversity was like. So just to show the kinds of experiences we had by all interacting together, this is a photo from a beautiful overlook in Rocky Mountain National Park, a place called Rainbow Curve, which has a huge pullout. And we spent about 20 minutes looking at the landscape there. And a couple of us decided to go ask people with different expertise what they saw. And the answers were these, and which were sort of reflective of interest. So the structural geologist says, I see migmatite dikes. And these represent partial melting, and they indicate the burial depth of some of these rocks before they were uplifted. The geomorphologist says, I see a U-shaped valley that's been shaped by glaciers. And some of us looking at environmental gradients of vegetation say, I see timberline. I see all these different life zones. And some mammalogists say, I see squirrel habitat. And of course, there's squirrels all over these rocks. But this shows partly the fact that looking at the very same scene, we get people picking out different details. And also, they also represent different processes and different timescales of processes. And so this just gives, in a somewhat amusing way, a sense of the different kinds of insights that are all brought together. Well, from these 7 years, we developed a number of always interesting, provocative questions. And I want to review 7 of the insights we gained from these. They're listed here, and I'm not going to read them because I'm going to go through them again more slowly. And I'm going to focus or dwell on 4 of these in a little bit more detail, because these are ones that are probably less clear to any of us, or less intuitively clear, something we might not have expected at the outset, and the others I'll go over a little more briefly. So different timescales of landscape and biological processes. If one stops to think about that, probably one starts to parse out, the fact that the tectonic processes, the mountain building processes occur over different timescales than mammal evolution and ecology occur on. But it's partly thinking, what is the nature of the process for these particular mountain ranges, and how might these processes be interacting? In any event, we do know now that the lifespan of a mountain range is tens of millions of years. and sometimes certainly the ranges may persist longer than, but from the initiation to the highest, the greatest elevation and relief would be tens of millions of years, and then possibly even more than that for that to erode away completely. Climatic changes occur over a massive range of time, really from almost all time scales, from decades to millions of years. And of course, they interact strongly with the landscape. Fluvial erosion, the stream erosion that reshapes mountains and drainage networks occur over hundreds to millions of years. And then speciation processes in mammals occur from thousands to on the order of about 1 million years, depending on the method of speciation. And then, of course, geographic range shifts occur over centuries to millennia. So we have many orders of magnitude of timescales here. And so we're trying to look at which of them are going to be interacting in such a way that some could actually be causal agents on others. And so we at least are thinking that the surface processes, the fluvial erosion, that is partly affected by climate, of course, are at least intermediate in timing as physical processes and provide a link between the longer-term tectonic processes and the shorter-term biological processes, overlapping with speciation, adaptation, and range shifts. This insight came out of our last field trip when the geologists were reflecting on the differences between the Basin and Range and the Rocky Mountains, and remarking that, noting the fact that there are very different kinds of bedrock, certainly different kinds of patterns of topography, and that noting that, of course, one of them is a compressional system, the Rocky Mountains reflecting basically plate convergence. The Basin and Range is an extensional system representing plates pulling apart. And they have different bedrock geology, with the Rocky Mountains having basement igneous and metamorphic rocks uplifted to high peaks, whereas the Basin and Range has mostly Paleozoic carbonates fragmented into multiple small mountain ranges, as we see here. And those of us studying mammal biogeography know that they have quite different species richness gradients, where there's this enormous pileup of range boundaries right along the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains, and then its equivalent stretching all the way down into Mexico, and this is where the plains geographic range, the geographic ranges of the plains species end, and some of the montane species begin, and then continue. Their ranges continue farther west, whereas in the Basin and Range, you see it kind of a light orange here. The regional richness is high all over the Basin and Range, but it's not concentrated in particular mountain ranges, rather high everywhere. And the difference very likely has to do with the different kinds of dispersal that are occurring when species encounter different kinds of barriers and different kinds of corridors. We're finding high barriers here along this, this enormous front range, whereas there are barriers in the mountains here, but there's so many corridors at low elevation that species have a chance to move around quite a bit. And then this here is just more of a speculation for future research. The different bedrock composition suggests research that one might do about the effects of geomorphology and substrate on mammal diversity, particularly those that are burrowers, because they would lead to different soil depth and possibly different kinds of vegetation. Another thing that we had already a bit formed as a question in our minds had to do with how much of the species richness that is characteristic of the mountains might be preserved in the fossil record. This is a concern for me as a paleontologist, because I'm well aware of the mountains being a biodiversity hotspot today, but most of the landscape in the mountains is erosional, whereas most of the sediments that form the terrestrial fossil record occur at low elevation in basins. So the question then becomes, if you look at those basin edges, where the sediments are coming out of the source areas in the mountains, do you find any hint of the montane diversity that might be coming down into the foothills and be preserved in the sediments that are accumulating there? And so because we can't really answer that question by looking at the fossil record per se, not at least not as well as we'd like. Colleagues and I decided to compare the distribution of the modern rodents of Colorado and Ecuador. You might think, now that's a sort of a strange comparison. Why would you do that? But there are a couple of good reasons. We had no idea at the beginning of the comparison. It turns out the two regions have almost exactly the same map area. They both have very strong elevational gradients and in topography and also in mammal diversity. The other thing that I didn't mention here is both of them have excellent documentation of not only the map view of the species of all the mammal species that live there, but also the elevational ranges. So we can actually study their elevational distributions in detail, and that's something you don't find in many of the atlases of the mammals of this place or that place. And of course, the Rocky Mountains are a very old mountain range, or relatively old, I'd say actually a middle-aged mountain range in a temperate climate, whereas the Andes are a young mountain range in a tropical climate. So there's some big differences. So we weren't sure what to expect, but what we did was we got a map of a digital elevation model of the unconsolidated sediments, which represent the alluvium and the aeolian sediments and some of the pyroclastic sediments of each region. And we looked at the overlap using GIS between the rodent geographic ranges and the unconsolidated sediments as a surrogate for the fossil record. So here is in sort of lurid coloring, the unconsolidated sediment map for Colorado, and the important sediments that might contribute to the fossil record are the alluvium. These are the river sediments that are partly coming out of the mountain valleys, the river valleys coming out onto the plains from the mountains. And this is the San Juan Basin, which is accumulating a huge amount of river sediments. It's a mid-high elevation basin. There are other small basins at high elevation that are pretty temporary and will probably not contribute to the long-term fossil record. And then there are two forms of aeolian sediments that are quite widespread on the Great Plains. Some of them are quaternary, but some of them go back much older than that because of all the volcanic activity in the West that has contributed ash deposits that have blown out onto the plains and have then settled there. So, these three categories comprise most of the unconsolidated sediments in Colorado. So in Colorado, a quarter of the surface area is covered by these unconsolidated sediments today. In Ecuador, it's somewhat different. And here's Ecuador, which is, of course, right on the equator. There, 16% of the surface area is covered by unconsolidated sediments. And here you see the alluvium, which is primarily the rivers that are draining the eastern side of the Andes. This is a large, now currently estuarine region, but during lower sea level would have been fully terrestrial with fluvial terraces at the upper end where the river is draining into it. So, and it's still as oftentimes at least partly a terrestrial habitat. And then these red patches represent high elevation pyroclastic sediments, which in principle would be very good at preserving fossils, at least probably for the next couple of million years. So we then compared the rodent distributions in both of these regions. In Colorado, we see 71 rodent species that occur from low to high elevation. 53 have overlap with alluvial and aeolian sediments between 1,000 meters, which is the elevation of the eastern edge of Colorado, all the way to 2,600 meters, where we start getting well up into the foothills. But these are animals whose elevational ranges goes well up into the mountains, but they're still overlapping with some of the foothills. It comes down into the foothills, so they're overlapping with these sediments. And then we find in Colorado peak richness occurring at about 1,800 meters with 51 species still overlapping in both aeolian and alluvial sediments. And that's right along the Front Range here. And then perhaps the southern part of the San Juan Basin. In Ecuador, we have 119 rodent species, so quite a few more, of course, because we're in a tropical megadiverse location. From low to high elevation, 95 species have overlap with alluvial and pyroclastic sediments over the same, from sea level all the way to 2,600 meters, representing almost 80% of the species there. And there are two peaks of species richness in Ecuador. One is primarily west of the Andes at low elevation at 200 meters with 55 species. Another one is at much higher elevation where we're getting the upper reaches of these alluvial sediments of the rivers and the pyroclastic sediments that are in higher plateaus. So in both cases, while these results show us that while we will never be able to be confident that we're capturing all of the high elevation mammal richness in the fossil record, both of these studies suggest that we are able to capture at least a substantial part of that in these foothill sediments where we're getting the unconsolidated sediments overlapping with some of the rodent ranges. So that left us, so far, these particular evaluations have left us confident that we're able to see at least a bit of that signal in the fossil record. And also suggests that we need to be extending this kind of comparison to other mountain systems, which might reveal either somewhat similar results or very different results. The next finding is that rates of change, rather than static properties of landscape, have a more substantial ability to predict changes in mammal diversity than the rates of change have a better ability to predict mammal diversity than the static descriptors. And these are two graphs, and I'll explain them in a more elaborate figure shortly, looking at species richness. In this case, this is for all mammals over the last 30 million years. And this part is the tectonically active basin and range, and this part is the Great Plains. So we see this big peak of mammal diversity right in the middle of the Miocene. And the mid-Miocene was a time of global warming, but it's also a period when the basin and range was extending most rapidly. And this figure here comes from our tectonics collaborator. It is the strain rate reconstructed from an analysis of fault movements, showing that the peak strain rate over the last 30 million years coincided with this peak in mammal richness, which we were very struck by this comparison when we first saw it. And these two graphs come from this whole series of graphs in a paper with the first author of my former student and Becca's former postdoc, Tara Smiley, now at Stony Brook, where we looked together, a group of us looked at the mammal richness, the mammal species turnover, family level turnover, the global climate record represented by the oxygen 18 record, and then the slope of that. So looking at the rate of change in that record, here's the strain rate again, and then also looking at other properties of landscape change that we thought might have an important role to play. The area of the Great Basin, which of course gets bigger and bigger and bigger as Nevada gets wider and wider and wider. And then the measure of topographic roughness or ruggedness here, and then also the proportional outcrop area. So we gathered all these data and then put them into generalized linear models to see which of these factors would have the greatest strength in predicting both the changes in mammal richness and the mammalian turnover. And here's what we find, and this is just a way of representing in color what you might just have in a table. So if each one of these colored boxes represents a different predictor variable with strain rate, temperature slope, which is the rate of temperature change, basin and range area, ruggedness, and outcrop area. And what we're seeing here is the top models for predicting species richness all show strain rate as the most important predictor, with the highest column here in terms of variable importance. And others, different, depending on the different models, other variables come into play as well. Temperature does come in as a secondary variable in some of these models. And then for species turnover, for family level turnover, here we see by a small fraction, we see that the rate of temperature change is has a greater variable importance than temperature value per se, or than the basin and range area in predicting species turnover. So these were the findings that led us to think that mammal diversity seems to be responding especially to the dynamics of the landscape, not just the properties of the landscape, which was something we could only learn, of course, by looking to the past. And so the likely processes involved probably involve dispersal abilities or lack of, either the encouragement or the hindrance of dispersal, as well as speciation and extinction. Another finding, which we really know by just looking at the world today, but also by looking at the past, we can see that this is something the past tells us as well, is that this richness gradient seems to be greatest during intervals of global warming, and that's when many species ranges move upslope, just as they are today. Because the Miocene climatic optimum during the middle Miocene, when terrestrial temperatures were somewhere between 5 and 7 degrees centigrade, greater than pre-industrial average today. And of course, we are possibly headed for similar conditions in another 100 years or so. And that's the time when we see this big peak of mammal diversity in Western North America, in the intermontane region, but not on the Great Plains. And we see a little bit of a hint of that signal in European mammal records as well. So we're seeing these that global warming is for reasons that seem quite well understood. During cooling intervals, in contrast, this richness gradient is muted or absent. So that helped me answer the question that I started out with quite a while ago. What does deep time tell us? It tells us that the topographic richness gradient itself is dynamic. It comes and goes rather than being present all the time. And probably a lot of this is controlled by dispersal. Speciation can certainly play a role if the warming interval lasts long enough, because then one has populations that are on high peaks that might be isolated from each other. So there is a chance for divergence, genetic and phenotypic divergence there. And so that's one that could well be contributing to some of the speciation that we see that goes back to the middle Miocene. The sixth finding is actually coming out of work that Becca has taken a lead on, and the whole idea for this project came from the first full day of our first full field trip, when we were out in the Toiyabe Range in Western Nevada, looking at, and Becca and her colleague Rebecca Rowe from the University of New Hampshire were describing their sampling of small mammals through this canyon, through this elevational gradient in the Toiyabe Range in the Western Basin and Range, and remarking on the well-known mid-elevation peak in diversity of many groups. And the geomorphologist said, well, did you know, what's interesting is the canyon relief tends to be the greatest at mid-elevations too. So this light bulb went off at that point, and Becca and the geomorphologist Brian Ioannidis have been collaborating on this project ever since, and now they have a manuscript that's well along and ready to be submitted soon. So what they found is that through this collaboration, is that if one looks at the canyon, the sort of map view of the canyon, here's the map view of Lamoille Canyon in the Ruby Mountains, and these orange dots are the sampling points for the small mammals, and the blue trace is the rivers going through the mountains. And then if you look at the distance from the outlet to the elevation on this digital elevation model, here you see the sampling locations for the small mammals, and here you see how the elevation is changing along this profile. And you can see then look at the relief along this. The greatest difference between the river elevation and the elevation of the mountaintops there is in the middle. And we can see that plotted up again in a different way here. If we just look at relief itself, that the peak of relief is right in the middle of this profile, which is, by putting together the mammal data and the geomorphic data, one can start to see these potential comparisons. And so they have done what we did with something similar to what we did with the Miocene data, or they've looked at a whole series of environmental variables, including standard variables that have been used for a lot of previous studies of mid-elevation peaks, precipitation, temperature, a vegetation index, a habitat diversity index, and then 4 geomorphic variables. And they evaluated these models with various combinations of predictors. And they find that the geomorphic variables, in particular relief, canyon relief, as well as canyon width, canyon relief having a positive effect on species richness, canyon width having a negative effect. These are consistently the most important predictors when you put these all together. And in their analysis, the geomorphology only variable had the top ranked model by AIC criteria. So very likely this processes involved would involve species packing and persistence in well-connected heterogeneous habitats. Because one of the things that the fluvial, more in the landscape evolution model of people have discovered is that mid-elevations not only have the highest relief, but they also have the greatest connectivity at these different elevations. So the ability of species to move around from small patches of habitat is really high here. And that might be one reason that species can, even in relatively small populations, can persist well at these mid-elevations. And then finally, this one is something that's sort of been hitting us over the head for many years already, but, and of course we have somewhat more limited insights into into montane regions as conservation priorities by looking in the past, except that since we are seeing the high topographic richness gradient expressed during warming intervals, we have the chance to see the phenomenon of biological attrition, where lowland species move out of low areas into high areas and then return during cooling intervals. And I have a sequence that I've documented in Pakistan that I think represents exactly that. So at least the fossil record enables us to see that this phenomenon that's occurring today may well be also represented in previous during climate change intervals. And what we see if we look at this phenomenon of lowland biological attrition, where when you get high heat stress, in some cases caused by simply the temperature rising. In other cases, it's a combination of both temperature and humidity, which stress the physiological ability of mammals to cool themselves at all, because if you have high humidity, you can't sweat or radiate heat outward. Then it's really important to be able to find a microclimate where you can escape the heat, or the population has to leave the area. So the phenomenon of biological attrition represents the documentation of plants or animals that are already moving from the lowlands to higher elevation. And a recent meta-analysis published by Colwell and Feely compared the upward versus poleward movements of species in the tropics versus temperate regions. And in the tropical shifts are dominated by those moving upward in elevation, many fewer of them moving latitudinally. Whereas in the temperate region, in shifts outside the tropics, they are about equally balanced. So because in the temperate region, of course, moving latitudinally, it is typically possible to get within not too far a distance to get to a cooler place with less heat stress. In the tropics, many species would have to travel more than 1,000 kilometers to get away from a heat-stressed environment. So elevation is often the only option. So these are and of course the processes involved have to do with dispersing to areas with physiologically tolerable conditions. So these are the findings that we arrived at after our years of collaboration, and most of these findings involve both data and insights from the fossil record and modern ecosystems. And we see differences and intriguing similarities across mountain systems that point to further research. And many of these insights rely on integration of landscape history from the geological perspective with mammal diversity, whether we're talking about the present or the past. And none of these insights would any of us have been able to come to entirely by any of us working in isolation. So the dedication to all of our field guides was always to Alexander von Humboldt. And because he, in the early 19th century, was the person who really championed the idea that biodiversity and landscape history are interconnected via many different kinds of processes. So we're happy to be, in a sense, kind of rediscovering what he already knew, not because we ever doubted him, but simply because we're recasting those inquiries into a different context. And I'm very pleased to be kind of acknowledging him once again. So I'd like to acknowledge principal collaborators in sort of crystallizing many of these ideas. Becca herself, Tara Smiley, David Fox, Brian Unites, Fabian Hardy, Samantha Hopkins, Joaquin Arroyo Cabrales, and the many participants in all of our gnarly workshops and field trips, 77 people from 40 institutions. And Juniper Grimes, who was a student here, who designed this, what we call our gnarly logo, which I think is so clever. You know, we have the rodents, the mountains, and the geomorphic agents all in one fantastic image. And of course, the National Science Foundation for funding this collaboration. And I'd be happy to take any of your questions. Don't be shy. Yes. Yeah.
What, when you're talking about topography and relief in Lamoille Canyon, for example,
Yeah.
Glacial Valley and relief is local relief related to that drainage.
Yeah.
Then there's the other relief, which is the scale of the western US.
Yeah.
Colorado Plateau.
Right.
So how do you compare those from their
Oh, that's a great question.
regional,
Yeah.
the scale?
It is a scaling question, and that's a great question because a lot of what drew my interest to this had to do with regional diversity and regional topography. And by particularly by working with mammalogists, we were able to create a whole a different set of questions that focus on local relief. And so there, I think, what we might say is they're both valid sets of inquiries, recognizing that they do represent different scales of landscape complexity and mammal richness. And our question might be, what processes are controlling the local interactions, and do they, if we scale those up to the regional picture, is it those processes there that also explain the larger pattern, or do we bring new processes in to explain the larger pattern? And I think that I would, at least thinking about that example compared to, say, the regional richness gradient, we're looking primarily in the canyon relief study at probably dispersal processes of species over thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. Whereas when we're looking at the regional relief, we're also dispersal is, I think, always an element, but we're also then starting to look at the evolutionary processes, because many of those represent lineages of many different ages, many of which have actually formed in that region. And so it's partly a matter of it's partly going back to the different time scales. So the temporal and spatial scales are interacting here. And so we're trying to identify the processes that are dominantly affecting those at the regional scale and comparing those to the local scale. So I see them as quite complementary. And Becca, I'd be happy if you wanted to, add anything to that, since you've thought a lot about the canyon topography. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Evolving over time across the region, not just. And they show that the elevations show up as the most frequent elevation across the regional swath. And I think one could actually look at the role of variability of these that region on richness. But I think the other thing that's going to come into play much more strongly than it does in a single canyon is the effective area, species area relationship. Because if mid elevations are your most frequent elevation, And we know that larger areas can host more species, and there's gonna be an area effect as well. That we can be working in tandem with the relief, and it may be that relief is contributing to that additional area. Yeah, so it'd be really cool to look at.
Yes.
Uh,
Oh,
distance, visualize that.
or if you're thinking about a region, yeah, exactly. Yeah, if you're looking at a big region. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Right. That's right. But it turns out that relief, once we've all started to dig into the details of these questions, it began to emerge to me at least that relief ultimately is probably more important to mammal richness and evolution than is elevation, because if you can have high elevations with huge flat plateaus. So up there's very little relief, and the environment can be fairly homogeneous. When you start getting high relief, you immediately get all manner of heterogeneity. You get north and south facing slopes. You get slopes that are mostly in shadow, some that are mostly in sun. You get some that get a lot of rain, some that get no rain. So you get very strong local microclimatic gradients. That also means then you have a lot of different microhabitats. So the ability to accommodate species with different life ways, seems more intrinsically related to relief than it does to elevation per se. Yeah. 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 Yes. Right. 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 Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Right. Good point. Good point. Yeah, that was something I wasn't expecting. I know it's always wonderful to be surprised, to find something you weren't expecting. Yeah. It's a question in the back. I think Cedar, did you have your hand up? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Elevation.
Mm-hmm.
So I was gonna ask about the local system, but I think.
Yeah.
Rebecca just answered this with the habitat complexity.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. Right.
So,
You were imagining, sorry, just didn't pick that up. Oh,
but
huh.
maybe the aspect that you mentioned.
They're probably their habitat heterogeneity is more limited than what's available on the entire mountain range. But, within the canyon itself, because most of these most of these elevational gradients are measured by a group of workers just doing a transect up a mountainside. So they're taking a swath, and this is a swath that a canyon has cut. And so, it's partly looking very narrowly at that particular profile, but that's not necessarily reflecting what's present over the entire range. What else? Is there anything on Zoom? Any questions coming from there? Okay, great. Good. Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Study on the program.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What do you think if you made a study up where you took the topography, pick your middle elevation scale from Wild Canyon, and project that across the whole landscape, and then went around to all of those elevations,
Oh.
in all of those places you would find similarly rich species, regardless of whether you're in canyon or in a plain?
I think it would matter whether or not the relief is similar at those
Yep.
elevations,
Mhm.
because just the raw elevation itself isn't.
Yep.
Mhm. Mhm.
But that'd be fun to try, I think.
And it's possible, going back to that model you mentioned, that model could explore that too, that question. You're talking about the Martyr et al. Model, right? Yeah, this model was just published this year in Science with, yeah, that's the one that with some of the collaborators on this project work, helping to develop that model, right? A landscape evolution model. Yeah, yeah. Mhm.
Someone else.
Mhm.
Yep.
A cleft. Yeah. Mhm. Mhm.
Similar, results where these two very different,
Uh-huh.
very different glacial history.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, those are some of the, again, some of the really interesting surprises comparing different places. I was even surprised at some of the proportional similarities in the study, the comparison of Colorado and Ecuador, given how many big differences there are between them, that similar proportions of species have overlap with these sediments that will make it into fossil record of the future. So interesting. Yeah, right. Yeah, 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 yes, yeah, yes.
You bring similar questions there, or
Great question. Pakistan has this fabulous, what I call low elevation record in these giant fluvial systems that have been accumulating sediments for, several million, many millions of years in what's called a foreland basin. But we don't have a comparable montane record because the Himalayas are so steep and they're eroding so fast that there's almost nothing being preserved up there for, there may be a few caves, um, but once you get to the Tibetan plateau, there you have a huge flat plateau and there are fossils up there and there are, I mean, there's at least, they, but of course, they're not the same thickness because there's not that basin accumulating fossils up there, and they're not yet well studied. So even that might be a great comparison to do in the future. But on the other hand, that's looking at it's quite different from comparing the Great Plains here, which have been tectonically quiescent for probably 100 million years, if not longer, with the intermontane region, starting with the Rocky Mountains all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So, and because the Great Plains, even though they're not accumulating a huge thickness, they do have both sediments and fossils preserved over about the last 30 million years. So, and have been quite well studied. So there may be a good comparison to do there. The other place I would think would be really valuable to look at would be comparing the Andes record to the Pampas, to Argentina, where there is a substantial fossil record on the lowlands of east of the Andes, which is now becoming well enough studied that one probably could do that kind of comparison into the future. But when we first got started, that was, I mean, and still will be, of course, it's still being studied intensively, but there's quite a literature now. And so I think that would be the next place to do that kind of comparison. But other fruitful comparisons might be the East African Rift Valley, which is very tectonically active with some of the lowland habitats around it. And there are a lot of people studying that record as well. That's quite a different tectonic setting, but it has some of the similar kinds of contrasts. And it also has very similar richness gradients today for mammals. So, and a very good fossil record. And so there might be some options there. Yeah, good question. Yes. Yeah. Well, partly because we had colleagues working at the Konza Prairie Long-Term Ecological Research Site, and because it is an undisturbed prairie. Most of the prairie has been turned into agriculture. And so on all of our field trips, we spent part of our time looking literally at the geology of the region, at fossil records of the region, and then in Kansas, we looked at 2 experimental grasslands, and the Konza Prairie was where we spent a day and a half. And there there are a couple of scientists there who've been documenting the small mammals in microhabitats all over the prairie for many years. So they knew in quite a bit of detail, you know, which species of mouse was going to live under the junipers and which species of mouse was going to live in the burn plot from, you know, right next to it that were different. And so we had all of their knowledge. And I think the main thing we learned on that trip, which was a wonderful insight, is that from a mouse's perspective, the prairie looks every bit as heterogeneous as a mountainside does because their home ranges are so small that, and the prairie is heterogeneous at a small scale. I mean, there's lots of wonderful plant diversity, just from a ridge top to a valley bottom, even if there's only 200 feet of relief. There's a huge difference in the kinds of plants. There are little riparian stretches in the valley bottoms. And so, and the live trapping showed that you get very distinct species assemblages of small mammals in these different places. So made me at least wonder, and this would be, I'm not sure exactly how one would study this, but whether from a small mammal perspective. So at the local scale, they may not know the difference, but it's because there's so much habitat turnover in the montane regions. I think that's where all that richness is coming from. The fact that you keep going upward and upward and you get this stacking of habitats, all of which are accommodating different small mammals. I think that's why you get that. I mean, that's just an idea, but the plains taught us a lot. And they taught us partly because there's such a contrast to the mountains, but they also forced us for the first time to think like a mouse. And we hadn't been doing that before. So that was really valuable. Yes, yes, that's right. That's right. That's right. That turned out to be a question that was asked at every single workshop and field trip that we had. And I'm not sure we ever answered it. I mean, we realized that it's something that has many answers, not just there's no point in arriving at just one. But although the concept may be shared among all those answers, but the answer is going to be so dependent on the context and which organisms you're considering that it wasn't as simple a question as it might have seemed. Yes, did you have a question?
Yeah, so David Lytle asked a question on Zoom. I'm gonna read it out loud. Dan Jansen? Yes, suggested back in the 60s that the breadth of species thermal niches
Yeah,
should be much narrower in tropical mountains
Right.
than temperate mountains.
right.
This is because there is almost no seasonality in the equator, so species can become temperature specialists at a specific elevation. And on temperate mountains, they need to be generalists.
Yeah.
Summer and winter differences are so large. Do you see any evidence for this thermal seasonality hypothesis in Colorado versus equator mammals?
Oh, that's a very good question. I don't think I haven't focused that question on that comparison, and I would have to spend more time with that. But one of our colleagues did try to take that question back to the Miocene, and she, at least, I don't know that she ever wrote the paper, but she used to give she had a talk saying mountain passes were higher in the Miocene. That's the title of the paper. That, yeah, we would think that because the middle Miocene, which was before we had an ice age, you know, we still had some ice in Antarctica, but we didn't have, you know, the cooling that we have now worldwide, that it may have been more, not quite megathermal like the tropics, but much warmer, perhaps more subtropical. So there may well have been much narrower thermal tolerances and thermal niches then than there are now. And she was arguing this because of the similarities and differences between assemblages that would have required species to get over mountains and in the Miocene. And so different patterns of similarity, a spatial similarity that she thought would argue for the fact that there were these, despite the fact that the nature of the landscape was such that she felt that there was quite a bit of dispersal limitation there that could only be explained by narrow thermal tolerances. So it's we have no way easily to assess the physiological capabilities of these ancient rodents, at least not yet. I'm not sure what metric we would use for that, but so we at least have taken that idea back into the fossil record, but I haven't thought about it in the Colorado-Ecuador comparison. I will as a consequence. Thank you. Yeah. Yep. Sure.
Biodiversity, you notice that at a certain point that no longer becomes relevant to like oxygen constraint and elevation change.
Oh. Oh, that's interesting. I haven't thought about that, but let me think about it now. I think at least in the mountain ranges we've been looking at, you would get to timberline before you'd run out of oxygen. So where oxygen might become a consideration would be, for example, in the high Himalayas, but you're well above a zone that any mammals could live in there. So I'm sure there's physical, some kind of physical geography or that would tell us at what elevation oxygen becomes so thin that that becomes a consideration. But I don't know that that is yet limiting the distribution of mammals, even of any size, um, before they're limited by snowline. So I don't think oxygen, but it's an interesting question and probably deserves some investigation. Yeah, thank you. Yes, yes, that's right. Right. And there are many different ways, and people know there are different ways that mammals achieve that. Some of them increase hemoglobin, others increase the oxygen binding capacity without increasing hemoglobin. So lots of different ways that different kinds of mammals respond to that. But it's a good question. Yeah, thank you.
Great.
Front yard.
Anybody want?